About 10 years ago, I made a video on YouTube titled something like Technical Interviews. It was basically half joke, because I thought it was funny, but it made one very important point about technical interviews. I got some good feedback on that. There were a couple of companies that did recruiting for contract positions that left comments or sent me messages that they never sent anybody anywhere without looking at that video. Well, the video became corrupted and it's no longer accessible. If it's even there, I probably deleted it. And in the meantime, I learned some new things, or realized the significance of some things I already knew, and thought I'd make another one. This won't be particularly funny, but we'll have to see. So, let's talk about technical interviews. Once you've read the job application, submitted your resume, if the potential employer decides to proceed further and possibly offer you employment, then you'll most likely have two additional interviews. One is a technical interview, usually by phone, and the other one will be in person to see if you have three heads. And that's a joke, but it's a metaphor to see what they can discover by meeting you that is not reflected in your resume or your technical knowledge. Whether you'd make a good employee. And I'm going to this time talk about how the interviewer should handle it and things not to do, and then how the interviewee should handle it, and that will contain the information that I had from 10 years ago as well. A lot of people don't like to do technical interviews. It's not part of their job description. When they hire you to be a DBA, I doubt if the job description says, oh yeah, and by the way, you'll do the technical interview for some other people. If there are a number of people in your organization that could do the technical interview for the job position in question, you really should consider it a bit of an honor. It means they think you know what you're talking about, and they think you know how to communicate well enough and organize well enough that you can give them some feedback that will be useful. They're not particularly asking you to do things they're going to do in the three-head interview. You're not going to evaluate the person's personality or figure out how easy they are to get along with. But if you do that, if you have some insight into those things as a result of the technical interview, I would not hesitate to pass it along, even though that was not requested. It will be appreciated almost certainly. They may form different opinions when they meet the person, but it's additional input from someone they have some respect for, which is you, because they've asked you to do the technical interview. Now, when you do the technical interview, you should prepare. I know that sounds surprising. A lot of people don't know how to do the three-head interview, and they don't prepare. I'm going to give you some tips on that, too. Or some tips. And so you need to prepare. Now, let me just say, for example, suppose you're interviewing somebody for a position that's a SQL DBA, SQL Server Database Administrator. Now, database administrator is a sort of a vague term, so you need to know what that includes. Maybe you know what it means in your company. It could include certain limited numbers of administrative tasks, more administrative tasks, or you may actually be a data architect and designing database structure and constraints and that sort of thing. So you need to read the job description. And then, if you think about it, you realize that even a SQL Server DBA that is performing a limited number of functions, really it covers several areas where people may have varying degrees of knowledge. If we say this job under SQL Server DBA, regardless of how it's defined, has responsibilities and areas of knowledge, subsets of knowledge from A to Z, Not everybody learns them in the same order. They may know a lot of stuff, but they may not know D or Q or S. They may not even know B, but still be very qualified. Because if they've learned all those other things, they can probably learn this thing too, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to have the background, skill, training, experience to learn the things they do know. So you need to figure out what those major categories are and at least create some questions that will get you into the subject matter. You may then choose to say, well, I'm going to see what the answers are before I dig any deeper. The thing you should realize is that even if you are hiring someone to replace you, or hire an additional person to do your same job, they are not going to be you. The point is not to prove how close to being you they are. They may have greater depth in some areas, less depth in other areas. They may have some relevant skills that you never thought of. And so your goal is to find out what they know. In my experience, and for certain limited jobs, this could be completely wrong. But there probably isn't any one of those things, A through Z, that if they were deficient on, would automatically disqualify them from the position of DBA as it has been defined. Now, let me tell you some things if you're interviewing that you should not do. I've already said you should not try to determine if they are you. They aren't. The only person that has your exact skill set is you. They may know more relevant things. Those are hard to make questions for if you don't know them. And they may have various levels of technical depth. So you need to find out. Now, if you have a certain area that you're investigating, say backup and restore or something like that, there's actually quite a bit to that. And if they don't know one aspect of it, they may know 6 other ways to do something that might be relevant in the appropriate circumstances. But in general, if you ask a very fundamental question and they don't know the answer, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep asking questions that prove over and over again that they don't know about that thing? That's a waste of time. You're being stupid. At that point, you should start examining your motives for why you're even doing that. You love beating down. I mean, I've had this happen. People want to, you say, I don't know anything about that, and they want to keep pounding in that you don't know anything about that. Stupid. Now, if they don't know something about something you really think they probably ought to, you might reword the question, approach it from a different direction, use a little bit different terminology, and discover, oh yeah, you're talking about this. But for you to keep dwelling on things that they don't know anything about is crazy. There's something else that I've seen done in technical interviews, almost exactly the same thing, but with very different intents. And so when you do some of these things, you have to say, why am I doing this? Suppose you have an interview and you ask a question, well, we had this problem for 2 months and we struggled and we finally came up with the answer. And you ask them about this technical issue, thinking that they might give an answer. Well, maybe they will, but there's a snowball's chance in hell if it took you 2 months to figure it out that they're going to have it on the tip of their tongue. Why are you asking that question? Are you asking it to prove that you're the smartest guy on the phone? I've had people do that. They weren't interviewing me to find out what I knew. They were interviewing me to tell me how great they were. Now, something similar to that is when someone has a recent problem or a future problem and they're actually asking your advice. They want to know, what do you think about this? Should we keep doing it this way? Is there another way to do it? They might be very happy to have you validate that they've done something the way of other people think about things. I had an interview like that once where they were going to do some things and they thought about it and they asked me, how would you do it? And it had to do with an aspect of SQL Server. I had an answer. What I didn't have on the tip of my tongue was the current thinking on the newest features of SQL Server that provided, in general, a better way of doing it. So when they told me that, we're planning on doing it this way, and oh gee, I wish I'd thought of that. I vaguely knew a little about it. Yes, they added this feature to address your problem, I thought. Well, let me just digress a little further and tell you that I did get that job. And when we tried to do it the best way, it turns out there were certain aspects of the way that they did it that actually made my answer the way they should do it. I didn't go around saying, I told you so, I told you so, because I still wish that I had validated their thinking at the time based on the information that was known at the time and the information that was presented to me in the interview. I don't think anybody puts out job applications and does interviews to pick people's brains so they don't have to pay them. They can just ask them during interviews. I guess that's conceivable. I don't think that happens. So you got to ask, why am I asking these questions? What am I going to do when they don't know? Now, I did a series of job interviews a number of years ago for someone who was actually going to come in and work with me. I was a staff augmentation person, and they were going to be too. In general, I would say if you've got somebody who is an employee of the company, it's best to have them do the interview unless they just don't have anybody qualified to do. And so, I asked my very first question. They were going to be writing Transact SQL stored procedures. A ton of people applied for it. My first question was, every variable in Transact SQL begins with the same character. What is it? A lot of people didn't know the answer. And that's kind of a showstopper. I tried not to be offensive or hurt anybody's feelings. I would ask other questions. But that's maybe too fundamental a question for the type of thing I'm talking about, where you ask them one thing and they don't know it. You move on to something else. When I was interviewed for my job at Microsoft, I had some great technical interviewers, and they had great questions. Interestingly enough, there was one particular aspect of SQL Server that I was being hired for that they had no one in their group that could do support on it. That was analysis services, and they didn't ask me any questions about that because they didn't know what questions to ask. But I was still going to be expected to do a lot of other things with SQL Server, integration server, reporting services not so much, because I was ultimately able to pick and choose some of my engagements, and a lot of people really did a lot of reporting services. But what they did that was really smart was they'd hit something, and they maybe want to talk about replication, and I know a little bit about replication, but replication has a zillion variations. And so when they probed a little deeper in a certain direction, I said, I'm really sorry, I don't know anything about that, whatever. That was fine with them. And they moved on to something else. They were trying to find out what I knew, not what I didn't know. And that was so smart. And that actually leads me to the most important thing I think you need to know about technical interviews. What to do if you don't know the answer to a question. Now, if it is a question on which everything hangs and you don't know the answer, I'm sorry, you're not going to get the job, but there's no reason trying to hide that in the interview from you or them or anything else. But here's what I had happen to me when I was talking to some of those people about, as I talked about in the job, hiring somebody to do Transact SQL. They may get past the first few questions, and then you'd ask them a question, and they wouldn't know the answer. But by God, they'd gush with a whole bunch of stuff they did know that maybe used some of the same words. Well, it was really annoying. I couldn't get a word edgewise to move on to find out what they did know. So if you get asked a question and you don't know what the answer is, shut the fuck up. It's to your advantage and their advantage. They can move on to other things. If you don't answer the question and then start gushing about things related to try to show that you know something, you'll piss them off because they have some things they want to find out about. You'll look like an idiot. Let me try to give a little bit more of an example about that. Suppose somebody asks you a question. You've got a table with some data in it. How do you add an identity column to that table that has the data such that it provides identity values for the rows that were created when there was no identity column? The answer to that is rather simple, rather surprising if you don't know the answer. If somebody didn't know the answer, that would not knock them out of anything. I've known some very smart people who knew a lot about SQL Server that assumed they knew the answer to that question, and it was wrong. So, what you have to do is ask, you know the joke, or not a joke, but you do this to people. Do you know what time it is? Yes. Well, what time is it? In an interview, you should go in with the attitude that if somebody asks, what time is it, or do you know what time it is, you say, yes, no, I don't know, I can find out. If I think about it a while, which I realize I can't do here, I think I have known the answer to that in the past. But you don't start talking about how clocks are made. It is to your advantage to give as short an answer as possible that demonstrates that you know what they're talking about. Sometimes knowing what they're talking about is as good as they're going to get from anybody in a real-time interactive interview. So you may not have to know the answer. You may just have to know what they're talking about and having an approach to how you would solve the problem, what sorts of things you would look for, that sort of thing. In the technical interview, and I'm going to contrast this with the other kind, you are not in control. The technical interviewer is in control. If you try to take control by insisting on telling them what you know that they have not asked about, you have failed. Your opinion may be different. I'd be glad to hear it. It's going to take a lot of persuading or examples or something to make me believe that. But I've just interviewed too many people that cannot keep their mouths shut at the right time. Now, what do you do if you are being interviewed and somebody is trying to prove they're the smartest person on the phone? First of all, I'd let them. That's what they want. That's what's going to make them happy. Give the best answers you can, but don't play any kind of, can you top this, or I'm smarter. You know, that's not going to work. You're in an unfortunate situation. You do the best you can. And in addition, you may ask a couple questions. They may say, oh, do you have any questions of me? Yeah. Am I going to work with you? Are you going to be in the cube next to mine? Now, you do that delicately. But, you know, if this is somebody you're going to work closely with, you might say, you know, is this the only job in the world? Am I going to have to work with this jerk? Because it's the point I'm going to make in the remaining video here, is they are not just interviewing you, you are interviewing them. Even if you don't ask any questions yourself, although there are some questions I think you should ask that we'll discuss in the next video.